The BBC is being heavily criticised over its biased coverage of Israel's devastating assault on Gaza.
How many times you have interviewed Israeli officials, Louise? Hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. How many times Israel have committed war crimes right live on your own cameras? Do you start by asking them to condemn themselves? You don't. No, I'll answer that question. You don't.
But we've been investigating another aspect of this scandal which hasn't been getting any attention at all. And that's the way that the BBC has virtually not given any coverage to how Britain has been heavily supporting Israel's military and political establishment throughout the last 15 months. Joining me to discuss this is my colleague Mark Curtis, who's just published a groundbreaking piece of research on the Declassified website looking exactly at this issue. For people who are watching this video, we would love to know what you think about how the BBC has been covering this issue. So please leave a comment below. And now, Mark, if you could start by taking us through the key findings from your investigation.
Yes, we wanted to investigate the BBC's written output, so its online outputs, not the broadcast and videos, but its online outputs, looking at the extent to which the BBC was telling the truth about the UK's policy towards Israel and indeed support for Israel throughout the destruction of Gaza. And so we investigated 16, actually, different categories of UK policy towards Israel, looking at, has the BBC covered this? And to what extent has it covered it? And how accurately has it covered it? And the top line is that the BBC is keeping the public in the dark. I mean, it is simply not telling the truth about the UK's support of Israel in the various ways that it is providing it. For example, the UK has been giving military training to Israeli armed forces personnel in the UK. That was admitted in Parliament last year. That has not been reported by the BBC in its online coverage, despite the fact that that is a significant, I think, statement of intent, statement of support for Israel at a time that it is destroying Gaza. The fact that the Ministry of Defence is prepared to conduct the training of those forces in Britain at this time is highly significant. Not to report that, I think, is quite shameful. Another aspect of policy is that last year the New York Times reported that there was a British intelligence team on the ground in Israel aiding Israeli intelligence. Again, that hasn't been reported by the BBC. Last November, the head of the Israeli military, Herzi Halevi, actually visited the UK at the invitation of the British Ministry of Defence to hold high-level meetings about military strategy in the region. A highly controversial visit. That wasn't reported by the BBC in its online coverage either. Yet that Israeli general has been leading Israeli military operations in Gaza since the very start of the latest phase of the war in October 2023. And we also discovered that he'd been given special immunity to visit the UK so that he would avoid being arrested over war crimes. So not to have reported these sort of key aspects of British policy seems to me to be fairly scandalous. And that's just 4 examples that I've just given. There are many other examples that this research uncovers, and I think what it amounts to at the end of the day is a cover-up.
And you've gone back through 15 months of coverage, and you've seen sort of perhaps 2 categories: things that they just haven't covered at all, that really only readers of Declassified will be aware of, and there's another category of aspects of UK support for Israel that they have occasionally covered, but not with the frequency or the critical slant that you might expect the public service broadcaster to be able to apply. Can you talk us through those kind of examples that you've come across?
Ever since October 2023, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, has been conducting surveillance flights over Gaza, spy flights that take off from the UK's massive military and intelligence base on Cyprus. And those flights have been providing intelligence to the Israelis. Now, the British government says that the only intelligence that they're providing to the Israelis is actually concerning hostages and the location of hostages. But that can't be guaranteed. There are concerns that we have and that others have as to whether those spy flights are also providing the Israelis with other intelligence, potentially to enable them to conduct the war. I mean, that's a legitimate concern, which I think many people have. So how much has the BBC actually reported those RAF surveillance flights over Gaza? Well, I found four stories in 15 months, and only one since December 2023, so only one in the whole of last year. And that was the only one that even raised the possibility that these spy flights might involve providing to the Israelis anything more than the Ministry of Defense claimed. The RAF has been flying hundreds of these flights, almost daily over Gaza. And it seems utterly extraordinary that the BBC would not cover that unless they deliberately chose not to cover that story.
And I should say, I mean, at Declassified, we're a team of just 5 journalists. And if you look back at our output over the last 15 months, all these issues that we've been able to cover, compared to the BBC, which has thousands of journalists, it's one of the world's largest media organisations. When it comes to this, Britain's support for the war in Gaza, their omissions are really noticeable. I mean, I've seen this myself when I've gone to cover the court case against Britain exporting weapons to Israel. This takes place at the High Court in London, so it's on the Strand, just sort of down the road, really, from the BBC, not far at all. I've not seen any BBC journalists there. It's not as if they don't know where the High Court is. Often, I mean, they're normally there every other day covering major news stories. They just don't seem interested in this case whatsoever. So there must be an editorial decision there to not cover this.
I mean, a highly noticeable thing, I mean, hard to miss, is that over the last few months, there clearly has been a crackdown by the UK authorities on pro-Palestinian journalists. For example, Asa Winstanley, the journalist with Electronic Intifada, had his home raided recently by counter-terrorism police on grounds of, well, we don't actually know on what grounds because it hasn't been made public, but we presume on grounds of some notion of being sympathetic to or expressing an opinion that could be conceived as sympathetic to Hamas. Now, one would have thought that action and the clampdown on other journalists by the authorities would have exercised the interest of BBC journalists. But I couldn't find a single article on the BBC website in its online written outputs that even mentioned the arrest of those journalists in Britain over the last few months. And you mentioned, Phil, about the legal case against the UK government brought by the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. And I couldn't find a single mention of that on the BBC website at all. So again, this, as you say, these must be editorial decisions not to cover certain things. That legal case against being brought by the ICJP is actually really important because it accuses ministers of complicity in war crimes. That's important. I mean, that's a big issue. And it's an obvious issue at a time when the Israelis are being accused of genocide. And I should say that in my decades, really, of analysing the BBC, I mean, my own conclusion is that the BBC is a mouthpiece for the British foreign policy establishment. And I think over Gaza, that's been clear. It has been a mouthpiece of the foreign policy establishment and is simply not telling the truth.
It does seem like there's a growing tide of criticism against the BBC now. I'm thinking in particular of the article by Owen Jones, which curiously wasn't published by The Guardian. It was published on Dropsite News instead. And there's also a protest planned outside the BBC, I think this weekend, by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which at the time of recording, I think the police have banned or put restrictions on. Whether that ban is overturned by the weekend remains to be seen. But do you feel like more and more people are, I mean, we've seen more support for Declassified's work. Lots of people very generously donated to our fundraising drive over Christmas, and we were able to raise £20,000 from the public. And, you know, people are still joining us as members of Declassified. Do you think, you know, that this is going to be a wider problem for the BBC going forwards? Obviously, it relies on the licence fee and the kind of consent of the public to some degree.
We've covered a number of stories on the Declassified website about BBC reporting, Guardian reporting, Sky News, and the other media as well. And it's the same story. These organisations are close to the establishment. They often parrot what the establishment wants to say. A lot of the stories covering the UK military in the media come from the Ministry of Defence. It's the Ministry of Defence who give journalists the stories that are then written up as news pieces. And that happens a lot. And that happens at the BBC. In fact, that happens at the BBC, I would say, regularly. But I do think that there is a groundswell of opinion now in the UK that is becoming bigger and bigger, that will force, particularly the BBC, which has to kind of respond to public opinion to an extent because we pay for it, that will force the BBC to actually improve its performance. Now, whether or not that is a significant improvement or whether it's going to be just cosmetic, whether it's a transformation, because that's what we would need to actually make it a genuine public service broadcaster, well, that's going to require a lot of campaigning and a lot of pressure on the BBC. So I think that certainly these protests that are taking place over the next few days are going to be really important. We need to utterly transform the media in this country. My view is that nothing will seriously change in the UK until the mainstream media is no longer relied on by millions of people. You know, we need millions of people to be relying on independent media that tell the truth, not on the mainstream media that have corporate and political agendas.
Thanks, Mark, for doing all this research and joining us today to talk about it. As you say, we need to transform the media landscape. And the more people who subscribe to our channel on YouTube, the more reach videos like this will get. So if you haven't already clicked the subscribe button below, please do so now. You can also make a donation to our work through the Super Thanks button or on our website. Thanks for watching.